Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Demand Response Providers and Southern California Edison's Local Capacity Requirement 2023 Load Impact Protocol Workshop for the final report. So some logistics for the meeting today. It will be recorded and will be available online at the DR Workshops website, which is also where all of the slide decks you will be seeing today are also located. I am your host, Andrew McGee, and you can reach me if you have any questions at andrew.mcgee, that's M-A-G-I-E, at cpuc.ca.gov. And if you have any technical support needs, you can reach out to Dan Hansen through the chat or at DG Hansen, which is Hansen at caenergy.com. Please take a moment to do a safety check and note your surroundings and emergency exits. Since we are still doing this virtually, please take a moment to also have an ergonomic check to make sure that your computer screen is kind of at eye level, as well as having your body in an upright and straight position. If you are having an emergency, please immediately leave the call and dial 911, or if you are able to use the chat, we can call 911 for you. For the meeting today, everyone is muted. And if you have any questions, which there will be a 10-minute period after each 20-minute presentation, please use the raise your hand function, which looks as the left hand raised. It says raise beneath it. And you can unmute yourself when you have been called. If you would rather type your questions, you can use the chat function, and we will be reading those questions aloud. And if you would like to respond to those answers that you're getting, you still will be able to unmute. But please remember to mute yourself when you have completed asking your question. This workshop is structured to allow the demand response providers to present their results of their LIP reports and engage questions on methods, ex post, ex ante, and others. Please keep all of your questions friendly and respectful, and use the chat feature only for questions or technical issues. Do not start or respond to sidebar conversations in the chat, or else we may lose important questions for our presenters. If you do want to have a specific conversation with someone, you can send direct messages to people by right-clicking on their name. Today's agenda, we have 6 DRPs and Southern California Edison presenting. It will be NResponse, C-Power, Leapfrog, OhmConnect, Voltus, and Sunrun. And each presentation, as I said, will be 20 minutes long and followed by a 10-minute Q&A session. And with that, I will pass it over to NResponse to begin.
All right. Hello, this is Dave Hanna. I'm presenting for Response. Sure, get my slides up. Dan, here after all, because I'm sure
Dave, I can't hear you very well. Are you? Do you need me to share the slides for you?
Would you share the slides?
Sure.
Yeah, make sure to speak up, Dave. You're a little far from your mic, or it appears so.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the issue is. I'm right on top of my laptop, so.
That's definitely better.
Okay, I'll stay right on top.
Okay, how's that?
That's good. To move, yeah. Slide, there we go. Yeah, to start with, just a little background on InterResponse. They're a demand response aggregator, and they manage about approximately 22,000 commercial, industrial, agriculture, and accounts in North America. InterResponse manages their customers by way of their DERMS platform. Some of InterResponse's customers are dispatched in a manual text fashion. Most of them are directly controlled. InterResponse has been actively fading in California DR since. Next slide. Okay, this evaluation covered 10 events that the InterResponse's customers participated in. These were all summer events. They ranged between 2 hours in length. And the number of customers varied, event to event. All participated. Next slide, please.
Yeah, Dave, sorry to interrupt, but your voice is still a little low and it will cut out at the end of your phrases.
Oh, okay. I will try and end on an uplift. InterResponse's customers can be broken into 2 categories. That's based on the technology that was used to achieve the load control or the load drop. In this case, HVAC equipment and water pumping equipment. Next slide, please. To go over the ex post methodology that was used, we used a modeling technique or a modeling method, regression method. We used that to develop baselines, and from that we subtracted the actual loads from the baselines to achieve the impact calculation. The modeling methods involved developing or determining whether customers were weather sensitive or not, and then breaking them out to building type categories. From there, we aggregated the data by those categories, the weather sensitivity, building type, and then tested a number of models. We had about 16 weather sensitive models and about 14 weather models and 6 non-weather sensitive models. Each one was then tested for bias and accuracy, the root mean squared error and the normalized absolute error, and created an index from those tests to determine the best fit model. Then we went back, assigned those models to each of the individual counts that were in each of those categories, building type and weather sensitivity categories, and ran each model through that specified, or ran each customer through that specified model. Those models were then used to calculate the baselines and subsequently calculated impacts. Next slide. This slide summarizes the results of the ex post analysis. See the mean reference load, the customer impact, and the relative curtailment temperature. Next slide. This particular graph shows the average impact across all the customers for the June 23rd event. You can see it was started at hour 17 and ended at hour 20. Next slide. This slide shows the September 30th event. Again, this one started at hour 16, an hour earlier than the June event, and ended at hour 20 as well. Next slide. To get a sense of the difference between the pumping loads and the HVAC loads, this particular graph just shows the pumping loads for typical 2022 events. This is a distinctly common shape for events for the pumping loads. They seem to take a dip in the mid to late afternoon and then rise later in the evening. Next slide. And this shows the HVAC impacts for a typical 22 event. Again, this is probably what most people have for HVAC DR kind of shape and impact. You get the typical rise throughout the day, starting to decline in the evening, and then you get the event hours, which are on 17 to 21. Next slide. The ex-ante methodology was very similar to that used in the ex-post analysis, and baseline models were used to develop the reference loads, but they were also used to develop the load impacts. The coefficients from those estimates were then used to simulate the reference loads and the load impacts for the various forecasted events. Next slide. To give you a sense of how important the weather was on the loads, you can see here the ex-post impacts versus temperature. In general, there's not a strong weather component to those impacts, but that doesn't mean that there weren't individual customers who had very strong weather sensitivity. Next slide. The enrollment forecast is provided here both by HVAC and pumping. Again, it appears that about each year they add about 1,000 or customers to their totals, and more on the pumping side than the HVAC side. Next slide. This table summarizes the ex-ante impact by end use for the August peak day in 2023. As you can see, the percent impacts relative to the reference load are about 10 times greater for pumping than they are for HVAC. And that was fairly visible in the ex-post analysis as well. Next slide. This graph shows that the distinction between pumping and HVAC again. Pumping for an August peak day in 2023, again, that same shape where reference loads dip in the later afternoon and then rise again in the evening. Next slide. Here again, HVAC, same August peak day 2023, typical looking HVAC shape and load impact as well. Next slide. This table shows the ex-antes by LCA for the August peak day. The differences on a mean impact basis aren't very different between the two LCAs, but in aggregate they're quite different because most of the customers are in the LA basin. Next slide. This table shows the typical event impact forecast across the 2023 to 2033 time frame. Much to comment. It's just a growth driven primarily by customer counts. Next slide. This slide is kind of a reconciliation of ex post to past ex antes. What you're seeing is the ex post in 2022, and then the forecast of ex post, the ex ante forecast for that same year from the 2021 evaluation and the 2020 evaluation. The differences are that the number of customers has been growing, the mix has been changing over time, and also the ex ante methodology used in 2021 was based on a percent impact estimator, whereas 2020 was a modeled impact, much the same as what we use or what we developed in 2022 for the ex ante. The percent impacts do change over that time frame, but I think what we're beginning to see is as the participant pool has been growing, we're getting a better feel for what the load impacts are expected to be, and I think getting more accurate as time moves on. Next slide. This probably sounds like a broken record for anybody who's been sitting in on these workshops for the last couple of years. It's been a challenge to develop accurate and unbiased reference loads for this pool of customers, particularly with the pumping loads. The pumping loads tend to be very irregular and unpredictable. They're not weather sensitive, and they change for a variety of reasons from day to day and hour to hour. But overall, they do seem to the models anyway seem to do a reasonable job at capturing the reference loads total. In future evaluations, we'll just continue to try and improve those estimates. Next. Any questions? Kind of flew through that, but.
Great, thank you for your presentation. I'm currently not seeing any questions or hands, so I will start with a couple questions from me. So particularly with your HVAC customers, are you seeing any snapback effects at the end or any pre-cooling beforehand?
Some on individual customer basis. There are some customers you'll see some what appears to be some pre-cooling, and in some customers you'll see some snapback, but in aggregate there doesn't seem to be a pronounced pre-cooling or snapback effect.
Great, thank you. Another question I have is, you talked about you switching in 2020 to 2021 your ex ante methodology between projecting actual load impacts versus a percent of reference load reduction. Can you go further into explaining what the difference in
Yeah.
building that regression model is like and why you switched between them?
Yeah, in 2021, the models, the ex-ante models, just were not doing very well at all. And we felt that the percent impacts was a reasonable approach to get an estimate of the impacts. It was encouraging that this year the models did better, and I think that may be because of how we went about developing models, the selection of models, and the verification of the verification of the models. So I feel more comfortable with the results this time around than in 2021. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, yes, that does. Does anyone have any questions possibly in relation to missing certain points if the audio had cut out for anyone? I see Alok has his hand raised.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. This is Alok, Energy Division. I actually have a couple of questions. And Andrew, do we also have program folks from InnerSponse besides the evaluator?
Yeah,
I believe we do.
Yeah.
Okay. So first, it seems like the enrollment was over 1,000 accounts for both HVACs and pumps. But can you go back to the slide where you were showing the exposed events? I think it was the first or second slide, maybe. Yeah, the event participation by load type. So why are these only adding up to a couple of hundred accounts?
Right. Not all the customers were called for each event. In total, there's in 2022, there were about a little over 2,500 customer accounts in total. But for any given event, you can see that not all of them were called. Maybe somebody from InnerSponse can give a better explanation as to why that's the case. I don't know.
Yeah, if anyone in InnerSponse raised their hand, I can unmute you, or Dan can unmute you.
Yeah, Nicolette.
All right, Nicolette, you should be able to unmute. You're still muted, by the way, Nicolette. Oh.
Is Nicolette not able to talk?
Yeah, so this is Dan. Just to be clear, the thing I can do is allow you to unmute. I can't actually unmute you. So by my settings, it looks like you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yeah, I'm seeing it as well, where most participants have the mic symbol with the circle and the slash through it, whereas yours is, Nicolette, it's just the mic symbol with the slash, not the circle.
Well, I guess while we're waiting for Nicolette or get the technology issue sorted out, on the eval side, these events were happening in the CAISO market. So for each of these events, there was an expected quantity. I mean, CAISO was expecting a certain quantity to show up for each of these events. So did you do a comparison of what was expected versus what was what your expos showed based on the LIP analysis?
I did not do that. Yeah, that information wasn't provided to me.
And you did not do that because that's not typically done as part of the LIP process, or it wasn't part of the scope requested by NResponse? And it seemed to be a natural question to compare, right? To analyze.
Yeah, it would. Yeah, I haven't been asked that in the past, and I wasn't asked that to do that this time around either. So I can't say.
I see. And then when you were projecting the ex-antes, you were showing August 2023. Shouldn't those ex-ante be for 2024?
It can be. I mean, I picked the year 2023 to make comparisons. You'll see all of the years in the report, but yeah, this particular, for the presentation purposes, I just picked 1 year.
I see. Andrew, I don't know is somebody calls in by phone, are they able to do audio then?
If you check the chat, she entered a response in there. Sorry, Nicolette, for the issues getting you unmuted. So she said only some sublabs were dispatched in these events and some enrolled customers were in utility programs.
So the customers here are a mix of IU programs, DRAM, and CCAs?
Yeah, maybe Nicolette, you can.
Okay, I see a chat message that the IU programs were not included. So presumably DRAM and CCA customers are included. So I guess I want to confirm that if a resource ID was dispatched based on Kaiser instructions, that all the customers in those resource IDs, whether they actually did something or not, are part of the analysis here in terms of what's being shown on this chart, and when you calculate the mean, the average responses in the next, I think the second 2 or 3 slides after this one, you were showing mean performances.
Right.
Right. So I guess it's important to confirm whether when a resource ID is called, whether this data set includes all the enrolled customers and not just the customers that were responding or performing rather.
Right. The indicator for each event was provided for specific accounts. So you know, one account could be showing as being called in one event and not another. So from my end, you know, I'm evaluating only those that are being asked to perform on a particular date.
So I've got a question along this line as well, and this is, I guess, for Nicolette to respond to in the chat, but the number of customers being called in the events on the slide we were at before, never reaching close to the total quantity. Is there a reason that test events where all customers should have been dispatched at the same time are not included in ex post?
Well, can we confirm whether test events are included or not?
My understanding, test events are not included.
So then what's the reason for excluding them?
It was NResponse's request.
But I mean, NSPONS would need a reason to exclude them. I mean, oh, I mean, all market events as well as test events are expected to be included in the LIP analysis. So I guess there are a couple of points we need to follow up with in response once we have audio. So the test question as well as confirmation of research society participation. Another question I have is, can we go back to the previous slide where you were showing the individual event data? Right. So I'm looking at going from August. So I'm seeing the number of customers changing between August 25th and September 6th and September 7th. I guess that could be explained by different quantities being scheduled by Kaizo.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we would want to confirm the research society participation level as well as the exclusion of test. Is it possible that NSPONS does a follow-up with you, Dave, and also includes the test data set?
Hello, Nicolette says that the test dates are actually included in this.
So then, so shouldn't the customer count be much higher in those dates then, on those events? Should be something in the neighborhood of 1,000 then, right?
Nicolette says to follow up with more details. So I think this may be an offline conversation.
Okay. All right. Well, so I guess that the general suggestion maybe is for, I don't know if you're going to run into the same situation with other presentations. There ought to be some analysis of what Kaiser is expecting and what the evaluator is determining was made available or what was actually achieved based on the LIP analysis. I mean, the point of this whole exercise is that there be some alignment between capacity estimation in the planning process versus capacity estimation in the operational space when the resource is participating in the market. I mean, they're not independent exercises, they're supposed to be related. So we can follow up on that, I guess, as a general matter. Let's continue, Andrew.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Dave, for your presentation.
All right.
Next, presenting, we have CPOWER.
Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Great. Alrighty then. Good morning, everyone. This is Karen Herder, and I'm presenting the load impact analysis for CPOWER's 2022 demand response programs.
Karen, right now we're just seeing your desktop flowers, I believe.
Flowers are nice. How about now?
Still the same.
Okay. It's strange because I am showing, but let's try again. Sorry.
Okay, Karen, are you doing double screens or something?
Yeah, and I know that's the problem. I just need to try to figure out how to fix it now.
Yeah, you might want to hide presenter view on one of the screens.
I am working on it, believe it or not.
Take your
Hang
time.
on. It doesn't give me the option of sharing anything except for my desktop, which is odd.
Would you like Dan to share for you?
Sure. And you're still seeing the desktop now, right?
We're
That's
still seeing
correct.
flowers.
All right. Dan, let me send you this and so that you have a version of it.
Okay.
Andrew,
should-
you have the slides, right? Are you able to share?
Dan will already have the slides.
Oh,
Great.
okay. Okay.
I don't have them yet. She's going to send them now.
Oh, okay. Are you able to see as I'm presenting now?
I can see it. Yeah.
Okay. Karen, I think I'll just share for you here.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Sorry about that.
No worries.
I think sometimes the MacBook Pros, no matter what you do, they don't quite work well with Teams. And of course, there are 3 or 4 different webinar software packages, and each one has different rules.
Yeah.
All right, as we go forward, go ahead and go to the next slide and we'll move through this. We're only 1 minute behind schedule, so I'm not going to stress. All right, so again, this is the load impact protocol evaluation for CPower, who is a leading energy management company providing demand response and energy efficiency services to commercial, industrial, and institutional customers in North America. So note that CPower does not have any residential customers in their portfolio. CPower is a subsidiary of LS Power, a power generation and transmission company with over 40 years of experience in the energy industry. CPower works with utilities to provide demand response, which allows commercial and industrial customers to earn money for reducing their energy usage during times when the grid is under stress. And they also provide energy efficiency solutions, including audits, retro commissioning, and equipment upgrades, and facilitate energy management. Next slide, please. CPower has over 1,200 customers in their portfolio across 5 different programs in California. Really 3 programs, the CBP, the DRAM, and RA, demand response programs at PG&E, Edison, and SDG&E. There are 6 categories that they identify within their portfolio: batteries, 3 different levels of HVAC with other loads, including lighting and refrigeration by itself, and also water pumping. And so this table shows how many customers there are in each program by end use. For this purpose, you can see that SCE is the only utility that has RA resources right now. CPower had us include all of the programs because they indicated that they would like all of these resources to be in the RA program. And so as we go forward, keep in mind that for 2022, a subset of these customers are in SCE's RA program, but that for future purposes, they have said they'd like all of these resources to be in the RA program. In total, about 280 commercial and industrial customers are in Edison's RA program currently. And again, over 1,250 customers in total in their portfolio. Next slide, please. This is a little exploratory analysis of the existing load shapes for each of the categories as provided by CPower. All 6 of the categories are included here for each month, May through October, which are the only months for which CPower called events. You can see that the largest load overall is the battery load. The HVAC loads and refrigeration and water pumping are all sort of similar in terms of being between 0 and 250 or 300 kilowatts. Next slide, please. We also looked at the temperature sensitivity for each of these 6 categories. And then based on these 6 categories, we identified 3 that we moved forward with. Battery stands on its own. We, looking forward in the ex post and ex ante, we evaluated battery as an individual category. All of the HVAC categories we combined into a single HVAC category for analysis purposes. And then the refrigeration and water pumping loads were both found to be relatively temperature independent. And although you look at the water pumping and you see that line that sort of, it's not flat like refrigeration is, but the R value, if you look in the report, is less than 0.2. It's quite low. So that line is a little misleading because the scatter across that line is pretty variable. So we chose anything under 0.2 R value of that trend line. We consider it temperature independent. And so refrigeration and water pumping, we sort of lumped into a single category, which also makes sense because I think there is just one refrigeration customer, and evaluating that single customer on its own was not very useful. Also, we did do additional analysis looking at the event structure, the event load shapes for water pumping and refrigeration, and they were actually quite similar. And so it did make sense to include these, to combine these 2 and call them just temperature independent loads. In contrast, both battery loads and the HVAC loads are temperature dependent, but the load shapes are quite different. And so we look at them separately. Next slide, please. These are indicators of how many event hours are in each hour for each program. And so you can see we did include the test events in our analysis here. There were not a lot of them, but total of 8 hours. And by hours, that means it could be 2 days, 4 hours each. In fact, that's quite likely. In hour ending 19, which is the 6 to 7 o'clock p.m. hour in the entire summer of 2022, only, let's say 2 days were called 4 hours each for a total of 8 hours. And so going down that list, you can see that the most hours were called in the CBP at Edison. Looking at Edison's RA program, the ISO dispatched only a total of 33 hours in the May to October months of 2022. Yes, Alok.
Thank you, Karen. You have two line items that are being called day ahead 1 to 6 and day off 1 to 6, but it's part of capacity bidding. So what's the distinction being made there versus ISO dispatch? I guess I would have assumed that those were also ISO dispatch.
They are ISO dispatch, but we separated them out because one is because they're separate customers. We could have combined them, and we can in the future. In fact, it's very simple for us to combine those if you prefer it that way.
Well, no, I
We
was
did
just
separate.
trying to, Karen, I was just trying to understand, were you trying to make a distinction in the event type? I mean, it's in the event type column, right? So one of them is being called ISO dispatch, the other one is being called day ahead 1 to 6 hour. Was that not a ISO dispatch?
I believe it's a ISO dispatch, but this is the way that CPower categorized them in their database, and so we use the same categorization.
I see. Okay. So other than the top row, which was the test event, every other row is a Kaiser dispatch.
Correct.
Okay.
I suppose, yeah, it might have been clearer if we had combined those two and just called them ISO dispatch. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine. And now that you've confirmed that everything is a Kaiser dispatch, other than test.
Great. Okay, any other questions on this table? Happy to take them as we go. Okay, next slide, please. Go to the next slide. We'll come back to this one. Sorry about that. So here I'd like to talk a little bit about the methodology for determining the ex-post baselines. And on the right, you can see the baseline list. Those are the baseline methodologies we used. One of the questions that we got is, that the N of 10 baseline methodology has, can be biased. And so the answer to that in our report, and I'll repeat it here, is we've looked at both regression analysis and N of 10, and we, both last year and the year before in the analyses that I've done, we looked at both types of analysis and found that the N of 10 baseline, surprisingly, because I'm, in my past, I've used regression analysis almost extensive. I'm going to say exclusively. I've never used N of 10 analysis before because most of the analysis that I've done in the past has been residential. But looking at the commercial and industrial, we tested both sets, several sets of N of 10 baselines and several types of regression baselines, and found that the N of 10 baselines just did a better job when we looked at the bias and error. And so I think it's possible that I don't mean to demean in any way the other evaluations presented here that use regression analysis, but it is worthwhile, I think, in most evaluations to look at both types of methodologies and see which one provides the best overall, the lowest bias and error. And we did do that in the last couple of years, and in both years, the regression analysis wasn't even close in terms of how it looked once we looked at the bias and error compared to the N of 10. So that said, we did use N of 10 estimates and tested several different versions of the N of 10. So there's the unadjusted N of 10, which just says take the last closest 5 of the last 10 days and average them. The unadjusted 10 of 10 says take the last 10 similar, and I would say work days, right? So weekdays for any Monday through Friday company, and this, you have to be careful there because not all companies are Monday through Friday, but we looked at the last 10 weekdays and averaged over those 10 weekdays and said that's the baseline. The California ISO has their own methods, strategies for determining 5 of 10 and 10 of 10 baselines that are scalar in the sense that they take the hours before the event hours and use a ratio. What's the difference between the event day and the non-event average? And they use that ratio to scale the baseline to better match the event day. And they use both 5 and 10 of 10. We created our own baseline, which was an additive 10 of 10. The first was a fixed 10 of 10, which was simply take the difference between the 10 of 10 unadjusted and the event day and line them up in the hours before the event. The 3 hours, 2 hours before the event is sort of the standard way to do it based on some old work by Meredith Fowley. No, not Meredith, Miriam, and I'm forgetting the name. I'm very sorry. I'll come back to that. But some original work by Miriam back in the early days of the LIP evaluation methodology work for the PUC showed that fixed and 10 of 10 is the best way to go. We looked at that, and it actually is, in our experience, the best way to go, with the exception of when in the table generators were required to also include overall energy use. And one of the things that the fixed additive does is that it biases the overall energy use. So we created a new one called the additive 10 of 10 variable, where we took the off-peak hours, which in the additive 10 of 10 are very different, and we split those. We reduced those to make them closer to the actual event day, without changing the hours before the event period. And so that allowed the peak period didn't change that analysis, and so you'll see, in fact, in these figures, you'll see the blue and the purple that are the additive 10 of 10 and additive 10 of 10 variable. They look almost exactly the same or exactly the same, and that's because this is showing the difference in the peak hours. In the non-peak hours, which is not shown here, the 10 of 10 variable is often much closer to reality, which gives us, in the table generators, a better estimate of how does it affect overall energy, because it includes the off-peak hours. In doing all of these 6, we take for every single meter and every single event, we use the one that has the least bias and error for that particular meter and event to ensure that the overall portfolio of impact estimates are as low bias and low error as possible. And I know this sounds complicated, but it's a little more straightforward than maybe I'm presenting it. So feel free to ask questions. Okay, moving on then. Next slide. Actually, go to the next. I'd like to show a picture because that is a little. Go to the next slide if you would. Go down until you find a. There we go. I did update this and resend it because I realized there was a better way to order to present these in. So we're going to go back and forth a little bit. So using that methodology, what we do is we create the gray line here, which is the reference load. And here we're showing CPower's actual 2022 loads in their portfolio for all of the IOUs, all of the programs, and all of the sublabs. And this is a single day. So I'm showing here one of the, what you might call an all-in test day, in the sense that it was September 7th was our big, one of the hottest days in California, where the governor sent out the text messages and asked everyone to drop load. Before that, of course, we called our DR programs and CPower. This was their response to the September 7th heat wave. And you can see across all the programs, they provided roughly 20 megawatts per hour in each hour. And so the baseline that we discussed is shown here in gray, and of course the difference between the baseline and the event. Now, where we found, where we lined up the baseline and the event day load, you can see where the blue matches the gray there along the first up until about hour 16, and then deviates once the event hits. All right, if you would go back up to the first table after the pretty rainbow graph. One more up. Is that it?
Yeah, this one's it. I skipped.
Thank you, Dan. All right, then. So if you take all of those numbers by month now, do it one for each month, we see that the total impact and the total impact, these are impacts per event. On average, in August and September, we're getting 27, 28, 29 megawatts or megawatt hours per hour in each event, which is around 15, 16, 17% of load in the peak hours during events. In June and July, I would say we're getting closer to 14, 15%. Now, May, it shows 20%, but these are smaller. The event count is 16, and May is sort of a funny month, of course, because it's the spring month. October, same here, but we're looking a little more like the spring and fall, getting around 14, 15%. But roughly, you know, looking across all the months, roughly about 15% load drop during events for the entire CPower portfolio. Actual. Next slide, please. These are the same results, but we split out all of the load impacts, ex post load impacts by load type instead of month, showing that the largest load drop comes from pumping and refrigeration. And I, regret not putting in some of those meter specific and event specific graphs because they are quite striking. This flat line and then this just giant dip of 81% on average during the peak event hours. And the downside of this is that there aren't as many of these customers in here as in the HVAC. And so with many more HVAC customers, we're getting much more load. On average, the total impact is almost 23 megawatts for the HVAC load. But overall, only 14% of the load drop. But with a larger customer base, of course, it's a larger load. Batteries, again, one of the newer loads coming up. And so we expect that batteries will increase in the future because it's a new technology. Right now, we only have about 1.5 megawatts actual load drop. Now, these numbers will change when we look at ex ante, because ex ante, we will assume that this is what's possible, right? In the ex ante, we'll talk about what's possible. Here in the ex post, we're talking about what actually happened, which is limited by the load that, this is the point that Alok made, it's limited by the load that the ISO actually called. And that's a great point that you made, and I think that's a good addition to the future guidance documents, is to have that included in these, because I would have loved to included that in this evaluation. It wasn't requested and it wasn't provided, but if it's included in the guidance documents, then going forward, we would certainly do that evaluation, which I think would be enlightening. Next slide, please.
One quick question, Karen.
Sure.
On the previous slide, did you say earlier that the battery end use was also expected to be temperature dependent?
Yes, both batteries and HVAC loads are temperature dependent.
And is that because the building load is temperature dependent that the battery is trying to offset?
That's a good question. I think that's probably likely part of it. I think also batteries are less efficient when they're hotter. But I'm not a battery expert, but I think those are the two main reasons. I'd love to hear other people's input on this if they know more about it than I do.
Okay. And can you remind me, I mean, I should know this, but can you remind me how we are supposed to interpret the 90% confidence interval?
Yes, that was my question too. On this slide, when 90% confidence interval goes below 0, does that mean that there's no statistically significant load drop in those months?
I think technically you could say that, but basically if you repeat this analysis 100 times, 90% of the time you're going to get the same results. Or 90% of the time you're going to get a statistically significant result.
But that result would be between the low and the maximum that you're showing, or I'm still not getting how to interpret 90%. I mean, we've seen this 100 times, but right now I'm just striking a blank.
Other than saying that if you repeat, if I started from scratch and did this, I think this is probably something better done offline, honestly.
Okay, well, I was just getting confused by the range, you know, the low number and the high number.
Right, there's a 90% chance that you will land. That's not quite right. The wording is tricky and it's failing me right now, but
well, okay, so we can come back to that later then.
Yeah, this is such a good question, and the wording around explaining it is tricky, and so I think let me work on that offline and finish this first, and then I promise I'll come back to it.
Sure.
Why don't we actually we could discuss that at the end when we have final questions, because it's going to relate to all of the presentations, right? So let's talk about that in the 2 to 3 question and answer period, if that's okay. We'll have a little tutorial. We'll have a group tutorial on 90% confidence interval. I think that's actually a great idea. I like it.
Thank you.
All right, next slide, please.
Would you like to do the heat wave slide or the final forecast?
Let's go to the heat wave slide. That would be a good one to see right now. Yeah. So these, again, this is the ex post analysis. So it shows the actual results, which will be close to ex ante because these results show nearly all of the customers have been called, right? This is the hottest day, or one of the hottest days. And on the left, I'm sorry. So September 6th is shown in the graph here, just as a visual that, most of the areas in California were between 104 and 113 degrees on September 6th. The table on the right shows the 1st, the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th. And those are the days on which nearly all CPower customers were called to respond to events. So you can think of this as, although it is an ex post actual load drop, you can think of it almost as this is a full potential load drop. This is about the most you could expect from the portfolio. And so you'll see here that on the hottest days, CPower provided about 30 megawatts each day of these during this heat wave. And it didn't change much, I would say, over time. There was a bit more on that very first day, but the 6th, 7th, and 8th held pretty constant right around 30 megawatts and between 17 and 18, 19% load drop during events, which is substantial. Just going to leave it at that. Any questions on this? As being sort of I wanted this to be in between the ex post because it is an ex post result, but then leading into the ex ante because this is going to be very similar to what we would expect for the full potential. Andrew, yes.
Yeah, so this ex post, is this looking again at CVP, DRAM, and CCA, or is this just the RA contracts with CCA?
This is, yes, this is all of them. Good question. All of these results are all of the programs. The ex post table generator, you can choose RA and see just what the RA provided. And this is a conversation that I think needs to be, and I'm sure will happen between CPower and the PUC during the discussions in terms of which of these programs can be bid into the RA. But the information I was given is they would like all of these customers to be in the RA. And so we've provided the full for the ex ante, but you can see the division, what was actually provided in the ex post table generator. So hopefully it's all transparent. And if you have any questions on that, I'm happy to answer as much as I know.
I appreciate the transparency and the breakouts. And we like to see the consistency, the results that you're showing here. So kudos for that. Kudos to CPower, I guess.
Great. All right. I've lost track, Dan. Where are we? Yes, correct. Well done. So the final forecast for 2024 to 2026 on a typical day, and I probably should have put the 1 of 10 in there too. On a typical day, we would expect in 2024, given what CPower has already increased their loads for next year, they have their contracts in place for next year. And so all of those, and you can find this in the report, have been increased to those amounts. In some cases, there's no change at all, and in others, there's a large increase. So you'll see quite a big difference between 2022 and 2023 in the report. And so we've extrapolated those values. They estimated about a 10 to 15% increase beyond next year. And these are the results that we are expecting for the full portfolio. Again, this includes all of the programs. In 2024, we're expecting about 45 megawatt load drop during events, the increasing to 50, 51 in 2025, and 57 in 2026. And then the report has this going all the way to 2034, I believe, or 2035. Any questions on this? All right, final slide, is it? Or do we have a couple more? Oh, I know. There's going to be, there's the final slide. Thank you.
Yeah, were there new slides that were missing that in your other presentation?
There were not, no, there were not new slides. I reordered them basically, which is why we flipped around a little bit. I think, Dan, we might have missed the ex ante load graph, and I'd like to end honestly on a load shape just because they're so pretty. So here's the ex ante. Doesn't look very much different from the ex post, and this is directly from the load generator. This is the 2023. I made the same mistake. It should be 2024 forecast for PG&E. This is just an example of what you can find in the table generator. All sublap, all loads. This shows the September peak, just as an example. I think I did this because it matches the the September 6th heat wave slide, and this is roughly what you would expect during a heat wave day in 2023. I guess that's why I included 2023 is because it's a little closer, but you can find 2024 through 2035, I believe, in the table generator online. And in fact, what is new on this slide, you'll see I added the numbers in for each point so that you can actually see how many megawatts in each hour during the event period. And I think it's not too late to upload those to what's online, and so that people can have that nice visual going forward. Okay, any questions on the entire presentation?
And as a reminder to everyone, please keep these questions brief because we're already over time.
I have no question. This was pretty clear.
I also, Karen, do not have any questions. We asked them mid-presentation.
Great, thanks.
But I do see a question from Sam Borgeson, and this question is, what calculation or metric is the confidence interval based on? I guess this is in relation to this, which we can, Karen, would you like to answer that now or leave that one to the end?
Yeah, we'll do it all at the end. I think that makes more sense. We'll spend some time on this.
All right, yeah, Sam, please keep your question in the back of your mind for the end. All right, thank you. And next we have Leapfrog Power presenting. I see Colin has their hand raised. You should be able to X-mute or unmute.
Thank you. Sorry, I just want to make it clear that it was me presenting. I don't know if that was known, so.
Thanks,
Yeah,
it
you
was
should-
not. I've also made you a presenter, so you should be able to share your slides.
All right. So are people seeing the slide deck?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm presenting for LEAP for the load impact evaluation that we did for their 2022 programs. I kind of whiffed on having an intro slide, but I can tell you that LEAP was founded in 2017. They had their first capacity awarded at their DRAM in 2018. And I think they've had load impact protocol studies submitted for the last 3 years. The agenda is pretty straightforward. Quick intro, which I'm doing right now, get into the LEAP portfolio, talk a little bit about the events, and then dive into ex post, ex ante methods and results. So the LEAP portfolio is pretty diverse. It's essentially a technology program that facilitates easy enrollment into DR programs that have customers from a wide variety of industries, but they segment them by load type. Also broken them out here by sector. You can see they have and depend various quantities from cold storage, HVAC, pumping, etc. And then they have in the residential sector, they have electric vehicle, a lot of HVAC, other which we don't cover. The black areas are redacted, and then they have storage as well. The other element to show on here is the number of NIDs, event IDs meaning individual events that were called, to give you some idea of the frequency of events, how often they happen. And then I also have the sublaps that are covered by these groups, just to give some sense of the range of geography that's covered. The counts are also there by utility, and what you'll see is that, well, PGE has the most customers. It's because they dominate the residential load types, and then SCE is second, but it actually has far more of the commercial, and then a sort of a distant third is SDG in there. In terms of the number of meters by event, and I think this is relevant because the dispatch of events is done and I don't know the specifics about what determines it, but it's very geographic specific based on the need. So for any given event, the number of meters that are actually dispatched varies a lot. For the commercial, when we get into methods, it's not as relevant because we're doing individual regressions, but for residential, we relied on panel data models, and obviously you want to have a sufficient number of meters in there. And what this is showing is that I'd probably say the cutoff in terms of what works well is probably around that 25th percentile, somewhere around 50 meters. It kind of depends on the season and the geography, but just as a rough rule. And the implication of that is that we were not able to come up with ex post impacts for every single event for those residential load types. Just a quick overview of the data sources. It's all the stuff people should be familiar with. For the ex post, we needed customer information, which had what the load type was, what the location, etc. Meter data says hourly delivered kilowatt hours. We actually received, in fact, 15-minute, but they were aggregated to the hourly. That was in part because none of the events were not strictly on an hour beginning, hour ending basis. So we didn't have any issues with like a 5:15 event. It was also just due to processing time. The huge amount of models we were running and data we were dealing with, sticking to 15-minute would have just been an obstacle in terms of doing this thing efficiently. Event data is just the event ID, the event type. LEAP has market events, test events, and then they also have combined events. And we also had the start and end time by meter. And then finally, weather data. So just hourly temperature readings, which were mapped to the meters based on the nearest Latin long. And then in addition, for the ex ante, we had the weather scenarios that are provided by the IOUs and CAISO. And then LEAP provided low and high enrollment forecasts by load type. This is a heat map just to give you an idea of how many events are called each month for the different load types. And this is in large part a function of how many meters there are, but it does show what you'd expect, which is that just the darker green areas are occurring mostly in those summer months, which is when you'd expect it. One exception is that EV residential program was distributed pretty evenly throughout the year. There's a couple dark spots there, but you can see that it's clearly has more coverage. I'm going to start now with the ex post impacts. So the residential approach, as I said earlier, was using panel data models. We segmented all of the customers by sublap, and then we did separate panel data models for each month. And the rationale for this was that there's geographic differences based on climate zones. So you could say that sublap is essentially a proxy for that. And then obviously the month is going to capture the weather variation. So when you think about residential HVAC, which is most of them, you're going to have a difference between coastal areas in Fresno, say, and obviously what you're going to see in terms of impacts in August are quite different from what you'd see in shoulder months or winter. As with most of these evaluations, we did a model selection process. We had several dozen candidate models, which incorporated different types of temperature variables, so different thresholds, square terms, etc. Also, whether or not for the winter months, whether or not we wanted to have a heating degree day or heating degree hour component of the model. And we selected proxy days, and based on performance, we selected the best model for each of those sublap and month segments. And then within the estimation, the way that LEAP does impacts or events, pardon me, is they can often have multiple events on the same day, sometimes overlapping, more typically consecutive. We didn't try to actually parse the impacts of a market versus the combined versus a test in those cases. So based on those event IDs, we would just combine them if they occurred on the same day. The the models we were running look at all of the hours in the day. So any hours that had an event hour in it, we would be looking for the impact. We did track very carefully which type of event was associated with it for analysis purposes. But in modeling, we didn't try to say this is a test event effect, this is a combined event effect, etc. There's also LEAP had a ELRP in there, which in September was a complicating factor. As I said earlier, participation events isn't uniform. They're dispatched based on need. So since not every meter was necessarily dispatched, that led to the opportunity to use the non-participating meters in each of those segments as kind of a control group. Not a matched control group, that we didn't do any, making sure that they could form the same loads, but they were, at least we knew that they were in the same load type, sector, and geographical area. Non-residential approach relied on individual regression models. We did a characterization of the sites to assess their weather sensitivity. Based on that weather sensitivity, there was a catalog of winter models, summer models for weather sensitive, and then just non-weather sensitive models. Don't know if I remember the specific numbers, but in the range of dozens for each. And then again, we did a proxy event day analysis to determine which model was best based on out of sample performance, and then that was used for the individual meter. So these are the ex post impacts as per capita average event KW by load type and month. And it's a lot of numbers on here. I think the things to highlight are for the residential, you can see the seasonality, particularly for HVAC. That's what you would expect. When you look at the non-residential, you do not see that seasonality. And I think what you'll see is there is a huge variety in what the average impacts are. And that is a product of not performance of the load type, but rather the makeup of the actual meters that were dispatched. So you have 300 meters and only 100 are dispatched. There's nothing systematic necessarily about their selection, but the impacts can vary so much that depending on who actually is dispatched, you get very different results. And I think that has implications when we look at the next slide, which is worth a lot of discussion. This is an attempt to look at what the full resource potential is. And the main thing that you'll see is that September is an outlier. It doesn't look like August and October. And that is driven mostly by pumping. And I would argue that that is not representative of what the full resource impact is in September. And we don't have insight into the specific meters that were dispatched in September, but what I can tell you is that it was, on average, the number of meters per event in September was about half of what it was in August. So August, having had so many more meters, is probably far more representative of what you would get in September for pumping. I know that with certainty for pumping, the other big contributor is the large battery storage, and I think that is a similar case, but I can't say it as concretely because I didn't investigate it as closely. To go to the next slide, this brings up the issue of September heat wave events. I think everyone's very familiar. Late August through mid-September, there was just a lot of events, and in some cases up to 9 consecutive days. We think this might have been this might have resulted in event fatigue. I think the question on pumping, and this question really came up too late in the game to investigate it, and I'm not really sure the data exists, but whether or not that low meter count was just simply a unwillingness to participate for those customers in September, given the number of events. Some of them are agricultural and might have just been unwilling to not do their irrigation during the extreme weather. we don't know, but again, the main point is just to reinforce that what we're seeing in September is what we would say is not representative of how the program can perform under more typical summer events. Finally, I'll get into the ex-ante impacts. So the approach is mostly informed by the ex post. In other words, we're using the same models that we used. The difference is that we're interacting the events with a weather term so that we can then look at the different weather scenarios and see what those impacts, how they might vary under the different weather conditions are. The other element is that we are using what we would call or at least what I call an hour of event approach. When you look at the load profiles of different events, the key thing that determines how much of an impact is the hour of the event, not when it starts. And that means not meaning the hour that it starts, but that first hour. And so the model specifications that we do are trying to capture that. The illustration on the left, if I can hopefully explain it clearly, is showing the difference of how that works. So we have a 9 August event and a 10 August event, and one started at hour ending 18 and went to 20. The other one started at hour ending 17 and it was a 2-hour event ending hour 18. And what I mean by the hour of the event, you can see that EH1, meaning hour of the event 1, is set to a flag of 1 in hour 18 for the 9 event, but for 10 August, it's in 17. This allowed us to use those parameter estimates to then apply to the full RA window. So the hour 1 event impacts are what end up going into that RA window starting at, hour ending 15, etc. Not all load types necessarily had a full 5-hour RA window. In fact, I think for residential, there might have been many months and sublapse that the maximum was 3. So what we did was we used, we derated the impacts based on sort of average declines, and this was done at the load type level. A key distinction that you'll see in load type is that you'll have some load types like pumping, where it's a switch. It can turn off at the start of the event, and it can basically be held. It can be turned off for the full duration. And you'll see a far smaller derate factor. With HVAC, you don't see that. You'll see that really pronounced first hour effect, and then it will gradually decline. So we use those derate factors to basically complete the full 5-hour RA window when needed. And then finally, those impacts at the per capita level were just multiplied by low and high enrollment scenarios that were provided by LEAP. And so here we're looking at the ex-ante impacts by load type. You'll see largely consistent with the ex post that the largest contributors are for commercial are that large battery storage and pumping. Non-residential HVAC also is in there as well. And you'll also see that in residential, HVAC is the only load type that we included for this. The other two are going to be pursued under DRAM, is my understanding. And then this is just meant to give you a sort of view over the full year of what the ex-ante potential looks like. This is the low enrollment forecast, utility 1 and 2 weather. It shows how most of the impacts are in that non-residential sector. It also shows, I think, the strong seasonality associated with the residential load types. And then finally, this is just the summary table of qualifying capacity values for that August 1 and 2 for both low and high growth scenarios in 2024. So LEAP is looking to get 89.36 megawatts for the low growth forecast and 107.33 for the high. So impact reconciliation was something we were asked to do, and that's the best way that we had, having we were not the evaluators last year, so we didn't have all of the data that we would have liked to do this, but we basically looked at the per capita impacts for the 2022 ex ante and comparing them to the ex post. And what we see in a lot of cases here with cold storage is that I think that's 1 or maybe 2 meters. So possibly just the volatility of their performance, or even if it was the same meter, could result in that big difference. I think in all of these cases, it's a factor. So I would say to some extent for the non-residential load types, it's not an apples to apples comparison. So we'll talk about the caveats on the next slide, but they kind of are what they are. The one that really should be a more relevant comparison to make is that res HVAC, and we're looking at an average hourly kW reduction of 0.6 from the ex ante, and then in 2023 we're looking at 0.27. And again, without the detailed data that we really need to dive into it, we think that this is, if anything, a product of the new customer makeup and the weighting. Residential HVAC is very highly variable depending on the climate zone. What you're going to see in coastal regions again versus Fresno, inland, other areas is quite different. And so we'd have to dig a lot deeper to give you a more certain justification of that as the explanation, but that is kind of the one eyebrow raising result that we came up with.
Excuse me.
And I kind of touched on this. Yeah.
Could you go back? I'm sorry for the interruption. Go back
Yeah,
to
no, it's okay.
I had to step away for a moment. On slide 18.
I'm trying to get to it. I'm sorry.
What are the 2 columns? I don't. What are the units? Are these megawatts or what?
They're in the bullet. They're per capita impacts. So average hourly kW impacts. Yeah.
kW impacts. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't see kW anyway.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
So, all right. Well, I'll digest this and we'll come back. Go ahead.
Okay. So these are just the caveats. Again, for the non-residential load types, ex post impacts are highly sensitive to customer makeup. So that could be and LEAP has experienced substantial growth, so that could just be due to the different meters that were analyzed in this year versus what was used for the ex ante the previous year. I just talked about the geography and the weighting. Overall, we had similar kW impacts for different sublabs. I would say the methods are a small factor. Certainly, they did a slightly different approach. We used regression models, and I think that they used a difference in differences adjusted 10-day baseline. That said, we are in both cases where we're using methods to pick the best performing model, and they are producing reasonable baselines, and if that's the case, then they should be getting similar results. And again, different evaluator for this round makes it a little bit harder for us to dig into the specific causes. So conclusions and recommendations. The full extent of the ex post impacts is incomplete. This just really gets into partially the inability to estimate all events, but I think more importantly, the relationship between the meters that were actually dispatched for an event versus what they look like for the full population. I'll just go back and think about that September difference, and when you're talking about only on average half the meters being dispatched, that can obviously have a big influence given how different they are in their impacts. As I said, the residential EV and battery storage, we did not include those in the ex ante. is you're using the delivered load. We don't have net load, and as I think people understand, EV customers and battery storage are highly correlated with the presence of solar. And so you end up with a lot of zero or nearly zero reads, which complicate the baseline estimation for those. If you go and look at a lot of load profiles, you can see pretty clear curtailment. The failure was really coming up with good baselines for those. And then the final bullet is just the ex ante methods. Filling that 5-hour event window is a little bit of a a round peg into a square hole. Events aren't dispatched in almost all cases. That's not always true, but for most cases, they're not dispatched in that RA window for a full 5 hours. So there's some manipulation that's going in place to make it conform to that. We think that it'd be worth investigating, maybe in addition to that, other ways to portray how the resources actually perform. So just looking at typical events based on the start of the event and the length, and giving sort of a flavor for how all the different events actually look, I think would be more realistic. And with that, that's the end. Happy to take questions. If there's anything on non-residential, I might call in my colleague Ethan. He's did a lot of basically all of the heavy lifting on the non-residential.
Great. Thank you very much for that presentation. I have a couple questions. Firstly, on your ex ante monthly values slide, why the large jump in June? That seems to be so much higher than other months.
I'm going to go back to it and see.
Ethan, I made you a presenter, so you should be able to unmute.
Great. I can take this one because it's a non-res call, unless you want to take it.
Yeah, well, I mean, my answer is going to be basically the same theme, that it's highly volatile to who was actually, which meters were actually dispatched for an event, and therefore those meters, there was probably one particularly large meter that happened to have an event in June that is possibly persuading that. But if Ethan can expand on that more clearly, that would be great.
Yeah, certainly. So for the non-res, we kind of grouped the sort of ex ante impacts by season and quarter in a way. So the impacts for April, May, and June reflect kind of the weather adjusted ex post impacts for just those months. So if the temperature ranges were kind of out of bounds, so to speak, it could have led to a little bit of an extrapolation bias there, kind of, seeing what the weather adjusted impacts, beyond what was observed. That could be one source, as Colin said, too. It's dependent upon kind of the impacts that were observed in that area. And I know for, say, large battery storage, there were significant load reductions from a couple of the very large participants. And so if there was a higher weighting of those dispatches, that could be one source too. So it's a little dependent upon who was dispatched in those months to a degree as well. So that's why you kind of see that those higher peaks there in June.
So then this is why May has higher impacts than July, and April is about the same as July, is that quarter itself is seeing generally higher per customer load impacts as opposed to the summer months?
Yeah, correct.
Correct. And again, due to the meters that were dispatched. So the April, May, and June clearly had some really high performers in there that went into that ex ante estimation. And those so there's a lot of moving parts. So.
Thank you. Another question I have, and this may be for operational staff at LEAP, between the low and high estimates for growth, this is the customer growth, does LEAP think one or the other is more or less likely, or are they equally likely? I see Andrew has raised his hand. You should be able to unmute.
Please
There we
try
go. I
again.
think that worked. Yep. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. So between the high and the low scenario, it really reflects kind of the partner acquisition scenarios that we see. So I would weight them equally at 50-50. The low is the conservative estimate of partner conversion and actually getting those meters through our funnel, whereas the high represents the reverse of, really it comes down to one or two partners being able to sign up and onboard quickly and really move their meters through the funnel. And we've seen that in the past where, given that it is a partner-based model, the growth in the portfolio is very chunky. So for example, I think it was about 10 months ago, we had 20,000 meters join the platform overnight in the Texas market, for instance. So the high and the low bounds are really just trying to capture what we believe is reasonable between or with that partner conversion.
Great, thank you. And the 9 consecutive days dispatched in September, the ex post data. Is there a particular reason that LEAP was still bidding into the market on all of those days? I mean, obviously, if LEAP has resources that can lower load during emergencies, we appreciate and expect LEAP to contribute as much as it can. But per the RA rules, only required 3 consecutive day dispatches if each dispatch is 4 hours long. So my question specifically is, we have up to 9 consecutive days of dispatch, but how long are those events, maybe on average, for customers that were dispatched for so many days in a row? Like, were they all 4 hours, or were they all just small 1 hour events?
I can't speak to the duration necessarily. I think that varies pretty substantially across that period, but I can speak to why resources were dispatched every day. That's in part due to the prevalence of ELRP events throughout that period, where we had many of our resources voluntarily dispatching throughout the weekend and during periods when they were not otherwise obligated to under the RA program. And that's in large part why we see such customer fatigue, particularly during the week of September 6th, is some of those customers had been voluntarily dispatching since the previous Thursday.
Go ahead.
This is Alok. I didn't understand that. So customers were being dispatched for ELRP. What do you mean by that? I mean, these customers are part of PDRs, right? So PDRs are getting dispatched by CAISO, and you are presumably trying to achieve some incremental load reduction on the CAISO dispatch. But what does it mean to say that customers are getting dispatched for ELRP?
So, for example, on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, particularly Sunday and Monday, which was a Sunday as well as a holiday, that was Labor Day. Under the existing RA construct, PDRs aren't required to bid into the market on Sundays and holidays. And so there were ELRP events on both of those days, and therefore we voluntarily dispatched our portfolio on both of those days.
So then were these
So that's what I
dispatches
mean, where
out of,
it's
would they
an
have been
out
out
of
of
market
market?
dispatch, correct?
Andrew, did you have more questions? Andrew McGee?
Yeah, then is ELRP data as part of this ex post?
When
I may kick that to,
No, that's
Kurt
for
and
us.
team.
So if they were ELRP only events, we did not include them in the ex post results. But quite often they would be combined, and you would have the ELRP was often it varies a lot, but a longer window that would extend the event window out a couple hours. It really complicated the analysis. And also this heat chart is just kind of showing you the number of consecutive days. I'd have to do a more granular meter by meter, blow by blow of how many individual meters were truly dispatched for 9 consecutive days. It doesn't mean that everyone that was dispatched had 9 consecutive days. It just meant that there was potentially for that load type 9 consecutive days of dispatch. So it's maybe missing some details.
Got it. Thank you. Last question on this before we move on to the next presentation. So you were saying that if there was even some dispatch that ELRP data was included, would this include let's say a 0.5 megawatt dispatch in CAISO, and then we're seeing something like 15 megawatts of load reduction through ELRP? Would that all still be included?
So the impacts that this came up during the analysis, and when you had ELRP events combined with a market event or test or combined or whatever, you would often see that there was a market response to what I would call the leap event, the market event. And then unfortunately what you would see is in the rest of the event window that was just ELRP based, you might see, for example, in Res HVAC, the snapback, which would if you had to be, we selected the impacts based only on the windows that were leap events, because otherwise you'd have that snapback occurring during what was technically an ELRP window, but it would distort what the actual effects of the event were.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Andrew, I have some questions. Is that okay?
Yes.
We may be pushing on time, but I think I need to get some of these questions. So following up on this business of market plus ELRP dispatches, and maybe this is a question back to Andrew Cole. So on a normal weekday, in the 5-hour array window, if the CAISO dispatch was for 2 hours, did LEAP dispatch those customers for the additional 3 hours in the RA window for the ELRP?
Thanks, Luke. Good question. So the way it worked is we would send dispatch signals for CAISO market awards through our standard procedures and process out to our partners. So that's the primary dispatch signal that the assets receive. And then for ELRP, it's kind of like an out of market, out of process additional email that we would send. So the way it would look on the partner or the asset end is, here's your binding market award that you need to dispatch for. And then if you are able and willing to dispatch for additional hours outside of that market window or market award window for those additional ELRP hours, then they can do so and we will pay them, or they will be compensated.
I see. Okay, so I have some other questions, but we can go back to Colin on that. I guess on slide 3, Colin, I don't know if you're able to scroll back quickly. you're showing all the different end users and number of events by end users. One more slide back. Yeah. Unique event IDs by different end users. I assume there were customers enrolled where they had multiple end users participating in PDR dispatches. Is that right?
I do not think that's the case. It is unique. A meter is a load type.
So there's only one load type per meter. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean to add to that, although we were provided kind of the meter level load type classification by LEAP. So maybe Andrew, you could elaborate on that if say cold storage also had something else with it, but cold storage was the primary mode through curtailment or something like that.
Okay, so can Andrew Cole confirm this?
That understanding is correct. So each customer, and sorry, I'm still seeing slide 8 on my screen, but it's by meter ID. So it's an individual site at each of those points.
All right, so in all these slides, we should assume that there's a single end use per meter in terms of the customer participation.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. So then another question is DRAM and CCA customers were mixed in this analysis, or were they kept separate?
DRAM and CCA. Sorry,
go ahead, Andrew.
Colin.
Well, my understanding is that the DRAM and CCA are, well, the DRAM is separate. That's what it came to ex ante, why we did not include the electric vehicle and storage as part of the ex ante RA filing.
But no, this was more about the ex-post. In the ex-post analysis, were we mixing up DRAM and CCA customers?
I would have to.
That is correct. Ex-post includes both DRAM and CCA events.
Yeah. So I think going forward, I mean, if you're going to mix up different programs, the premise is going to be that these programs are being operated similarly, and and that may not be the case. I mean, I think an evaluator should be looking at whether, I mean, if the programs are being operated differently, then the exposed data sets should be separated and analyzed separately. And I guess in terms of staff analysis, looking at all the third-party participation, we are seeing dramatic differences between DRAM portfolios and CCA portfolios, which suggests that we shouldn't be mixing the data sets in ex-post analysis.
So I can't go back in time and fix that, but what I can do, I believe we actually have the data to at least give you some sense of the breakout between the two, so that you would know what the mix was.
Is that already included in the table generator?
It is not. Those are data that we came across later.
I see.
And I'd actually, if Andrew can confirm that when we did that later data request, that those data would help us do that breakout.
I can confirm that, though I don't believe you have the data for the full year. So
oh,
we'll
that's
have
true, because it was only for the September heat wave that we did that. So yeah, okay. But with those data, we could at least give you that. We can give you that breakout to give you some idea of what the mix is.
Okay. So one question on slide 8. I think it's slide 8, where you had the per capita load impacts.
Sorry, it's just like a lag, so I'm not sure if.
That doesn't look like the right one.
Oh, it's this one?
Yes, here you go.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm sort of confused by this chart in terms of the month-to-month variation of the per capita load impact. So I'm looking at the large battery storage column. So presumably these are large CNI customers where the on-site load should far exceed the battery sizes. So I guess I would expect more uniformity in month-to-month per capita battery dispatch. So what's going on here?
So again, it's a function far more of which meters were actually dispatched. So if you just pick 2 months, if you pick ones with big contrasts like April and May, that is not necessarily, in fact, I'm quite sure it is not the same meters that are being dispatched. And they vary greatly in terms of what each individual meters, the systems that they have on site are and what they can get out of it.
Yeah, and to add to that point, I know specifically for large battery storage, there was 1 or 2 meters that were capable of multiple megawatts of curtailment and demonstrated that, but there were also a number of what were still classified as large battery storage, but were substantially smaller than kind of the high end. I shouldn't say the high end, but the larger meter loads. So, as Colin said, it's dependent upon the frequency of those dispatches and how
It
those.
kind of gets to that issue that we never really have a full resource dispatch that occurs to say. So that's that can maybe explain it poorly in the recommendations, but that extrapolation is complicated by that.
Okay. Another question on the EV column, EV under non-residential.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure we're interpreting this right. So this is an indication that on non-event days, whatever the average charging behavior was on event days, these sites were actually curtailing, preventing charging during those hours?
You said a non-residential. I think Ethan would have to answer that. I
Yeah,
think
I'm sorry, Lo. Can you repeat the question?
I'm trying to
Sound cut out
understand
quickly.
the load impacts in the EV column like August and September. Does this mean that relative to the average charging behavior on non-event days, during the events, these sites were actually preventing charging?
Yeah, so I mean, we had delivered load. I think to answer that more explicitly, we'd need kind of like a sub-metered load. But what we saw relative to the baseline behavior for that meter, we saw curtailments on those days. Yeah.
Okay.
Did I answer your question,
right.
Luke, or did I just sidestep it?
Yeah, no, yeah, that's fine. That answers the question. And
Okay.
then one more question for Andrew Cole. In terms of the resource IDs that get called on by CAISO, even though you have one end use per meter, I assume you're mixing the different end uses in one resource ID. Is that right?
That is correct. Each resource ID is going to be an aggregation of individual end users.
I see. But in the ex post analysis, that's getting all separated out.
Correct. The LIPs look at end users specifically and have no construct of resource IDs and CAISO dispatches, to my knowledge.
Right. Well, I mean, I think we talked about setting expectations for the next time around, that we do want to compare ex post performance relative to CAISO expectations, which is going to involve a resource ID construct. Anyway, so we can come back to that later. So I'm done with my questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Leap and Verdun, for your presentation. And lastly, before we get to the long-awaited lunch break, we will have OhmConnect present.
Actually, Andrew, could I suggest that we take a break now? Because I'm not sure. We're probably going to go longer than your break was scheduled at 11:40, right?
That's correct. And this would put us at a lunch from 12 to 1.
So 11:40 means we only have 8 minutes. I mean, that's not going to be enough for OhmConnect.
Yeah, that's what I mean. We would give them the full 30 minutes and we would go to lunch at 12. Would you rather go to lunch now?
Let's take a break now. Okay, is that possible? We do 11:30 to 12:30 lunch break. Can we just do a snap poll here? People object to that?
That's fine by me. And I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
So let's take a break now. 11:30 to 12:30. I'm back at 12:30.
All right, I'll see everyone then.
Maybe you want to put it on your screen, Andrew, so people can see that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Andrew, do you mind if I stop recording for the break and start again, just so we'll have different sessions?
Yeah, you can stop the recording for the break. That's fine with me.
Great, thanks.